I'm Lai Leong with the Center for Presidential History with my colleague Greta Swain. Today is October 29th, 2023. We're in New York City. Could you please introduce yourself and what you do?
My name is Steve Hadley. I was a class of '69 at Cornell, and I'm currently a consultant, but I was National Security Advisor under President Bush during his George W. Bush during his second term.
Mr. Hadley, how did you meet Professor LaFeber?
I took his course. I took it in my senior year, so it had been fall of '68 into spring of '69. And he, of course, was a fabulous lecturer, and I got to know him in that connection over the course of the time of troubles at Cornell, which was a testing time. And it was wonderful in some sense to be able to go through that time while taking his course and while being able to talk with him about what was really going on and what it mattered for Cornell and for the country.
What did he say? What were your conversations during that time?
Well, he, I think, was unsettled by what was happening on the campus. And I remember at one point I went to him and I said, this was in the spring when the campus was in the process of breaking up or blowing up. I said to him, you know, the kids in the street cite you as a rationale for what they're doing, that it's all business interests that are behind American foreign policy, not principles or morals, and that therefore it in some sense justifies their critique of our foreign policy, which was, of course, galvanized by what was happening at Vietnam at the time. And I think that struck Professor LaFeber. I think it surprised him a little bit. I didn't get a chance to talk to him much further because shortly after that he canceled the rest of his classes in his diplomatic history course for the rest of the spring. But it is interesting that I think the kids in the street thought he was with them. And of course, that was certainly not the case. He was not at all supportive of the kind of demonstrations that were about to shut the university down.
Did you ever talk to him afterwards in later years about that event or those events?
We did not so much. Not so much. I did not see him for a number of years. I was not one of his students in the sense that he was not my advisor. I really took his course my senior year and did not have occasion to have the kind of ongoing relation with him that a lot of the students, particularly those who studied with him and had him as their advisor, did.
Tell me about your recollection of his course, the one that you took. What was he like? What was he like in the classroom? Did you visit office hours? What were your interactions like with him?
He was very charismatic. The class was, in my year, was taught Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. You know, Saturday is a hard day to get kids to come to class. Well, his class was always packed on Saturday. In some cases, if parents were visiting, kids would bring their parents along to watch Professor LaFeber do his class. He would walk in, he would go to the board, put 4 or 5 lines on the blackboard, throw his overcoat onto a chair, and then lean back on a desk, arms folded, and start talking. And he would talk for the next 50 minutes. And it would be a riveting lecture, well organized. It had a beginning, a middle, and an end, always brought to a conclusion right at the end of the 50 minutes. I think the thing I remember most is he was a very charismatic person, but he was a terrific storyteller. And he taught foreign policy in some sense through the stories of individuals. And he would pick out an individual who he thought was pivotal to his time, whether it was John Quincy Adams or Herbert Hoover or whoever. And he would basically give you a little background, how the person grew up, what his background was, what shaped their views, what was their view about foreign policy and the geopolitical situation at the time, and what were they trying to do in terms of foreign policy? What were their assumptions, and what policies did they pursue? And then he would show you how they played out. And invariably, it was a sad tale. It was a case where the person he was talking about either did not really understand the nations with which they were dealing or the situation in which the country found itself, had assumptions that were wrong, or whose plans were frustrated by events that the person did not foresee. And it was a cautionary tale, actually, about foreign policy, how challenging it is, how America, as powerful as it was, particularly after the First World War, was still limited in its conceptions and limited in its ability to implement and carry those conceptions out. And most of the figures he talked about in the end ended up frustrated and failing to achieve the objectives that they set for the country in its foreign policy during their period. So for those of us who went into government, it's a little bit of a cautionary tale, a little bit better be humble. This is going to be harder than you think.
Was he someone or someone whose work you found yourself hearkening to when you were in government?
A little bit, but you know, a lot of it was period specific. And the challenge is once you get in government, you know, you're working in a different framework, different set of players at a different time, different context. So I think what stayed with you were a few principles. One was the one I described, that you better be a little bit humble about your ability to achieve our country's objectives through its foreign policy. He had a couple of other things he said. I remember the first day of his first lecture, the first line of my notes, I went back to look at my notes from his lecture. I still have them, all his lectures during that year. And the first lecture he gave, the first note I wrote was, foreign policy should be followed or pursued in service of ensuring the survival of the country. And I think about when I was in the George W. Bush administration after 9/11, the survival of the country seemed very much at stake. And that was certainly an organizing principle as we went out, the Bush administration, to rally the international community in the service of countering global terrorism. So keeping your eye on the ball, that foreign policy is in service of ensuring the survival and prosperity of the United States, I think was a good first principle. The other principle he articulated was how you need to understand foreign policy through our domestic policy. That domestic policy is going to drive foreign policy. Domestic politics are going to set the context and limitations on your foreign policy. And that was certainly something that we saw, those of us who went into government service, saw all the time as we dealt with the foreign policy in the United States.
That's remarkable that you actually kept your notes from that time. When did you pick up again your relationship with Professor LaFeber?
I would see him from time to time. There would be gatherings when he would come to Washington. One of his former students would get a group of people together and you'd get a chance to talk with him. And I would try to go to those events and see him when he was in town. And so it was very much episodic. And then I tried to see him when I would come to Cornell after I left the George W. Bush administration. I would come up for speaking events at Cornell, and I would try to stop by and see him at his home during that period. He's a very gracious man. And one of the things I think that made him so effective as a teacher is he was very interested in teaching. He had a passion for it, and he was very interested in his students. So, you know, he would come to events, primarily actually, for example, when he came to Washington, to be able to maintain contact with those of his students that were serving in administrations, whether Republican or Democratic. He was interested in his students, what they were doing, what they were thinking, how they were, I think, evolving over time. And I think that's one of the things that made him such an effective teacher, is you knew he was interested in teaching and he was interested in the people that he taught.
Personal interest aside, did you get a sense that he was also looking for insights into how policy making worked from the inside?
I think he had a pretty good idea of how policy was made. He did have an interest in the particular issues of the day and what the people who were in the administration could tell him about the debates that were going on in the administration and the kind of considerations were at play. So while he was a historian, he was also very much a student of the contemporary scene in terms of what was going on in foreign policy.
In addition to asking questions, did you get a sense of where he was coming from in terms of his own assessment of the current events that you were alluding to?
Not so much. He was more interested in listening than talking in those interactions and exchanges. As I say, one of the things about him is he was a remarkably gracious person, and a person who, in terms of my interactions with him, always had his ego well in hand. You know, my friend Bob Einhorn mentioned some years ago that Walt was born in 1933, which means in 1968, when I was taking his course, he was 35 years old, not particularly an old man. We were 21, 22 at the time, so he was only 13, 14 years older than me. But he seemed so much older, so mature, so centered, so wise, that we were all kind of learning at the feet of the master. And yet he was only 35 years old at that time.
You're not the first person to say that. And I'm really curious to hear that. I mean, you yourself, of course, have reached the highest echelons of government. And many people would say that you are equally wise. But what do you think made him...
There are a lot of people who would have a very different view of that question, but thank you.
What do you think made him, at 35, full-formed adult, but as you say, not old by any means. What do you think gave him that depth of knowledge?
Look, he was a historian, and he had spent, at that point in time, he had studied American foreign policy. He was steeped in American foreign policy. He, as I say, had understood the reality of how challenging it is to make foreign policy, and how often the best, as my grandmother would say, the best laid plans of mice and men gang after glee, which means often go astray. So I think he would, in some sense, been matured by his study of history. And it gave him a perspective on the world and perspective on foreign policy that showed both in the substance of his lectures, but also how he carried himself as a man.
As you mentioned earlier, some would suggest that President George W. Bush perhaps might have benefited from some of the cautionary tales that Professor LaFeber shared in his lectures. To what extent did you ever get a sense of what Professor LaFeber thought about the policies of President Bush?
I don't know. He was, as I say, a very gracious man. And one of my last emails from him, in the time that I was leaving the Bush administration, he said a very nice thing. He said, I think I knew where you were in 1969 in the time of troubles. I think I knew where you were in 2007. And I think he meant there the surge in Iraq, which President Bush ordered, which when the whole country thought we were about to withdraw from Iraq, President Bush decided we were going to actually double down, change strategy, add troops. And it had the effect of taking a war we were losing into a war in which, in the end of the day, we did defeat al-Qaeda in Iraq. So a war that, in the end, we won. And I thought it was interesting that he would pick that out. And then he was kind enough to say, I'm sorry that you're not staying on in the new administration. to do foreign policy. So I think at some measure, he was supportive of what we did in the Bush administration. But you know, you don't get to choose the challenges you face. And you take after 9/11, when this nation was attacked by Al-Qaeda, and we told the Taliban, who were in control of Afghanistan at the time, they needed to, sorry, it was attacked by Al-Qaeda. Let me start that again.
Sure.
We learned after 9/11, when the country was attacked by Al-Qaeda, and when the Taliban in Afghanistan refused to kick Al-Qaeda out of the country and ensure that they could not mount a successor attack on the country, the president decided we have to go into Afghanistan to overturn the Taliban and go after and deal with the Al-Qaeda threat. In some sense, that was not a matter of choice. That was something that was thrust upon him, and having decided we needed to do that to take the fight to the enemy abroad so we don't need to deal with the enemy at home, then the consequences, well, what do you do when you overthrow the Taliban in Afghanistan? Do you walk away from it, as we did in the Reagan period after the Soviet Union was pushed out of Afghanistan? We did, and radicals and the Taliban and extremist groups took over the country. Or do you try to help the people of Afghanistan build a more prosperous and more stable, more secure, more democratic society? And if you decide that that is the right mission for the United States, then a lot of things follow. So you don't have a choice in all of these matters. And sometimes you take on challenges where prospectively you're not confident that you can do it, but you think you have an obligation on the part of the country to try. In retrospect, it looks like may have been our reach exceeded our grasp. But you know, you don't know that in advance. So I think it's a complicated business. And history is taught with the benefit of hindsight, but policy is made without that benefit. It's shaping the future going forward.
In a 2016 panel on which you appeared with Professor LaFeber, you may remember this.
I do.
Was, at Cornell about Cornell's role or contribution to diplomacy. You said, or you talked about drawing from lessons you learned at Cornell in the 1960s and applying them to the war in Iraq. I don't know if you recall what you said, but I wonder if you could maybe expand on that.
Well, when President Bush asked me to be National Security Advisor in 2004, 2005, the country was in the middle of the Iraq War. It was not going well. Demonstrations were beginning. And one of the things I thought when President Bush offered me the job was, this is going to be great. I'm going to be presiding as National Security Advisor over foreign policy at a time when the country is going into the kind of civil discontent and disruption that we saw during the Vietnam War. And I'm going to get to work with that kind of disruption as we deal with the problem of Iraq. That actually did not come to pass. There were demonstrations in the United States and elsewhere, but the country did not go through the kind of almost nervous breakdown that it went through during the time of the Vietnam War, for which we all should be very grateful. But one of the challenges that I took was we've got to find a way to turn the situation in Iraq around. The Vietnam showed us that the cost of failing in that endeavor, what it did to America's self-confidence, what it did to America's standing in the world, was we needed to avoid that happening again. So one of the things we did was to take as a task, isn't there a way that somehow we can turn Iraq around so it is not the kind of failure that Vietnam was perceived to be? And with the surge that the president announced in January of 2007, the change of strategy on the ground in Iraq, we were able to turn that situation around so that when we left office in January of 2009, Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups were not a strategic threat to Iraq. The violence, while still ongoing and the terrorist incidents still occurring, they could be managed by the Iraqi government and the Iraqi security forces. That was a huge accomplishment, and it avoided having to go through the period of self-doubt and recrimination that followed the Vietnam War. That, I think, was one of the important accomplishments of the Bush administration, of which I was privileged to be a part.
In his last public lecture, Professor, that you were not able to attend, I think Sandy Berger was there, but you were not able to attend.
Correct.
And he actually, Professor LaFeber actually referred to your absence, and I think he missed your presence there that night. But he concluded his in fact, I would say the focus of the second part of his lecture was about Wilson and Wilsonian ideals and about the spread of democracy. And he was actually quite critical. I think it would be fair to suggest that his assessment of Wilson was a largely negative one, that he might have suggested that Wilson tried to do too much. And given the time, that was around the time that you were just talking about, had you been there, what might you have taken away from what Professor LaFeber said?
Well, there's a great struggle in our understanding of our foreign policy between the idealists and the realists. And the idealists are really personified in terms of Wilson. And Wilson had this notion that sort of if we pursued our ideals in the world, public opinion and the growing interdependence of the world would sort of vindicate those ideals and could be the engine of our foreign policy. And yet one of the things I realized when I reviewed my notes from Walter LaFeber's course, balance of power was very important to him. He understood the importance of balance of power in the international system. And I remember in my notes, it describes him talking about the League of Nations, and he said, if the great powers at the time had worked out their misunderstandings and disputes, then the League of Nations could have been a vehicle for disciplining and enforcing those understandings. But absent the great powers having resolved the tensions between them, the League of Nations was destined to fail. And so the Bush administration's view was you didn't have to choose between idealism and realism. That in some sense, a world which is based on American ideals of freedom, democracy, rule of law, human rights, is a much better world for the United States and achieves our realistic objectives of a world in which the United States will be safe, secure, and prosperous. So the Bush administration's view was there isn't a tension there, but you need to pursue those ideals in a way that shows a recognition of the realities of the world and the importance of balance of power. That we used to say you need a balance of power that favors freedom. Yes, you want to act in the world to advance our ideals and principles, but you need to rally behind those ideals and principles a balance of power based on the United States working with its friends and allies to promote those ideals in the face of countries, aggressor nations or totalitarian nations or authoritarian nations that do not embrace our ideals and principles. So in some sense, what I learned and what we tried to do in the Bush administration was fuse the two trains in foreign policy, the two strains in foreign policy, that is to say, idealism and realism, and try to do in a situation where they are mutually reinforcing and complementary, rather than at war with each other.
It sounds like you are very much a student of history. I mean, I think keeping the notes from your undergraduate class is a testament to that. Did you have a sense, in your evolving relationship with Professor LaFeber, that he himself might have evolved as a historian?
I don't know. I'm not an academic. I'm a practitioner. I haven't read all his books and seen how he evolved over time or read the various versions of his book on the Cold War, for example, which would be a good way to try to divine whether he in fact had the kind of evolution that you're talking about. I'm really, I would not know. I would not be able to answer that question. You have to put that to the historians.
And we have, and we will. But in terms of your conversations with him, perhaps, after all, you knew him over decades. Did you have a sense of how his ideas might have evolved?
I did not.
Talk a little bit more about your relationship with him at a more personal level. I know you talked about how he was a good listener, how he asked questions. Do you recall any specific encounter, or tell us a story, that you think of when you think of Professor LaFeber?
Well, there are two. One was the conversation I already mentioned where I talked to him about how the kids demonstrating in the streets in the 1960s felt he was on their side because he was a critique in their view of American foreign policy as being too much a slave of commercial and business interests. I think that's a misperception of his foreign policy, but that was the view that many folks had. Another incident, I guess I would say, is we were both put on a thing called the Morrison Commission, which I think was in 1968, maybe 67, 68. And it was to look at the role of students in decision making. It was a way to try to respond to some of the discontent on campuses and the demands by students that they have a greater say in how the university would be run. And we went through about 3 or 4 meetings, and at some point, Walter LaFeber resigned from the commission. I felt a little bit abandoned because I was still on it. So I went to see him and I said, "Why did you step down from the commission?" And he said, because I don't think 19 and 20-year-olds are in the best position to be running the university. I agreed with that. I didn't think that's what the Morrison Commission was about. But it's interesting that that was his reaction. And so in some sense, while the radical left thought perhaps he was an ally, he was a pretty conservative person. You saw that in that kind of reaction. You see it in his criticism of Wilson, his emphasis on balance of power, the realities of power relations in international affairs.
It's quite remarkable, a conference like this. I don't know, I'm not aware of another historian or academic who has such command over former students in so many fields: government, academia, industry. What do you think what made this man so inspiring?
One, he was a master of his field and a master historian and a gifted teacher. As I said, he was very charismatic, had a great style in front of the classroom, no notes, arms folded, talking for 50 minutes and bringing a dazzling lecture to a successful conclusion. He cared about his students. He cared about teaching. I think all of those things together made him a really remarkable figure and a memorable figure. He also was teaching for my generation, he was teaching foreign policy at a time which, because of the Vietnam War, was very much an issue of the day. He was relevant, as we would say, in the current age. I think all those things together tell you who he was as a person, as a teacher, and explains the great loyalty that so many of us had for him. The other thing I would say is that for a lot of us, he opened the window on the whole area of national security and foreign policy. And a number of us were inspired by his class to go into those fields and professions. And they made for a very rewarding professional life for so many of us. And a lot of us, when we get together, we will say how much we owe to Professor LaFeber, because without having taken his class and without having been introduced by him to this wonderful field of foreign policy, we would not have had the careers that we had. So we owe him a great debt of gratitude.
Do you think he will continue to be relevant as you say? Do you expect his perspectives on history to continue? Speaking as a person who has been as active in foreign policy making as you have.
I certainly hope so.
Well, those are all the prompts I have. I don't know if there's
Good.
any more recollection that you might want to share.
I don't.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.